Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
We're going to bring the companies back. We're going to lower taxes still further for companies that are going to make their product in the USA. We're going to protect those companies with strong tariffs, because I'm a believer in tariffs. I'm not sure that you are. I don't think you are, but I congratulate you on your career. But to me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff, and it's my favorite word. It needs a public relations firm.
Welcome back to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to move markets, countries and economies like never before. So we created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Stephanie Flanders, joining you this week from the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Sao Paulo.
I'm Adrian Wooldridge.
And I'm Allegra Stratton, and both Adrian and I are in the less glamorous London.
So we started the show with that clip from former President Donald Trump's conversation with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwait, at the Economic Club of Chicago last week. For about an hour, John asked Trump about his platform. They talked about taxes, immigration. But what they talked most about, and obviously which made Voternomics excited, was tariffs. And I guess it's not so surprising when, as you just heard, tariff is Trump's favourite word. I guess another surprise, Allegra and Adrian, was not just that, but the fact that there was so much support in the audience. This Chicago Economic Club members, respectable business folk, some people have said that they must have packed the room, the Trump people, and there were quite a lot of staffers there. But actually, I think the main reason, and my colleagues who were sitting at tables during the event waiting for them to come on, said, no, absolutely, these were regular, respected members of the Midwest business community who really like tariffs, even though most economists think that they're bad for business. So I thought it would be exciting for the three of us to get into whether we should be so surprised by all this. And we're going to talk to a very distinguished economist about it, Danny Roderick, who's not so surprised. And we're going to have a chat with John Micklethwait about the event itself and what he took away from it. But Adrian, you think America's history provides part of the answer to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think America has always been a very pro-tariff country. And I think a lot of British people, British free traders in particular, tend to think of America as being like a giant version of Britain and a giant free trading nation. And I think from the foundation of the country, from Alexander Hamilton's infant industry report, America has relied on tariffs. It's relied on tariffs to raise revenue because the federal government wasn't allowed initially to raise taxes, and also on tariffs to sort of shape industrial policy to catch up with the United Kingdom at the time. And in particular, the Republican Party has been a very tariff-focused party. The industrial Republicans have really relished tariffs as a way of keeping out British competition, Britain then being the most industrialized country in the world. One peculiar and rather unpleasant example of this is that during the Civil War, the economists had a great internal debate as to whether to support the North or the South.
The Economist magazine, this is. The
Economist magazine, that is, whether to support the North or the South. And on the one hand, the North was on the side of abolishing slavery, but on the other side, the South was in favour of free trade because they depended on trade in cotton. And the economists rather unfortunately came out with the conclusion that free trade was a more important principle than abolishing slavery. So they decided, for a while at least, to endorse the South. So you get very counterintuitive things. And it's only really after 1945, when America is by far the most powerful country in the world, that it embraces free trade. And free trade, because it doesn't really have any competition. So there is this muscle memory in the United States, particularly in the Midwest and particularly in the business community, of tariffs being really rather good American things.
Can you imagine in the UK that being something that at a prime ministerial wannabe would go out and say, I'm going to do an hour's interview? A, you can't imagine that, or not many of them. But then B, that they would say, this is going to be my newsline. My newsline is going to be, tariffs is the most beautiful word, my favourite word. And then secondly, I think it really, for me, rammed home the United Kingdom and the debate in this country, obviously understandably focused on the budget next week, but that we have not processed what the economics of the next American president might mean for the United Kingdom.
You know, this thing that is quite boring. I mean, in general, tariffs have been considered a pretty boring bit of international trade, has been very politically potent. There was a fantastic bit of research that David Autor did, the economist who had also did a lot to put all of the information about the China shock to manufacturing workers on the map. And he's looked at whether or not the tariffs in the first Trump administration helped employment in those protected sectors, those bits of manufacturing. And in fact, it didn't sort of help or hurt in those sectors, and it definitely hurt jobs, as you'd imagine, in the industries that found that their costs were much higher because these imports were now more expensive, whether it's on steel or other things. But even though it hadn't been economically successful, like it actually hadn't helped the groups it was supposed to help, and it had hurt other groups, it had been more politically successful. He'd gone to these counties and found that where there were more tariffs, there was less support for Democrats, more support for Republicans. So you can see why he's continued down this road.
One reason why America can afford to be pro-tariffs, of course, is that it's a gigantic internal market. It's a huge... America, when it was hiding behind these tariffs, also had behind it the world's biggest market. And, you know, Europe was absolutely crisscrossed with tiny countries and all of which had barriers to trade and tariffs. America was a free trading, you know, subcontinent, hiding behind barriers. The other thing about in the early 20th century, the Republicans and the business community were a pro-tariff community, but then they were a rising power that wasn't really central to the world economy. Now they are central to the world economy. So the implications of the world's most, you know, important country intertwined with the rest of the world institutionally and through commerce, turning to tariffs is absolutely massive and massively negative in a way that it wasn't historically.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of that. We're going to talk to the Harvard professor Danny Roderick, professor of international political economy at Harvard Kennedy School. But first, we thought we should have a quick chat with the man himself, John Micklethwait. Let's have a reminder first of some of all that tariff talk in his interview.
You're going to basically stop trade with China. You're talking about 60% trade on that, 60% tariffs on that. You're talking, as you said, 100, 200% on things you don't really like. You're also talking about 10, 20% tariffs on the rest of the world. That is going to have a serious effect on the overall economy. And yes, you're going to find some people who will gain from individual tariffs. The overall effect could be massive in terms of the economy.
I agree it's going to have a massive effect, positive effect. It's going to be a positive, not a negative.
Well,
let me just tell you. I know how committed you are to this, and it must be hard for you to, spend 25 years talking about tariffs as being negative and then have somebody explain to you that you're totally wrong. It'll have a negative. It will have. I'll go a step further. If you don't do this, this country has no chance.
40 million jobs is a lot of jobs to rely on.
They're all coming back.
What about consumers? People out there.
They're going to be the biggest beneficiaries.
Yeah, critics say your tariffs will end up being like a national sales tax.
No,
because
the countries
if you have America at the moment has $3 trillion worth of imports, you're going to add tariffs to every single one of them. That is going to push up the cost for all those people who want to buy foreign goods.
No. What's going to happen?
That is just simple mathematics, President Trump.
It's not. Yeah, it is, but not the way you figure it. I was always very good at mathematics.
Yes.
Let me tell you, you're saying $3 trillion.
That's $3 trillion worth of imports.
And they don't have to pay. And the higher the tariff, the more likely it is to have them come into the country.
The higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to have to pay in shops.
John, thanks so much for joining us on Voternomics. You're here with me in Sao Paulo, where we're both interviewing some very exciting people. I have the US Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, which I think will be...
I have Bill Gates.
And I think both of those will be quite different from your interview with former President Trump. Now, you've said you want the interview to stand on its own and not do commentary around it, and we're obviously going to respect that. But I did want to ask you whether you were surprised by the focus on tariffs and sort of whether it changed your understanding of how much that was going to drive his policy and might continue to shape our world if we do see Trump re-elected.
I've left the interview to stand there because I think what's important is what he said rather than particularly what I think. But on the issue of tariffs, I think it was a surprise to many people just how clear he is about what he wants to do there. And I think it makes it quite difficult for people in the business community who've sat there saying, well, look, he isn't really going to do this, when I think it's one of his core beliefs. It's something that goes all the way back to his initial opposition to NAFTA a long, long time ago, when that was very unfashionable in the business community. And I think it's something that's actually a kind of key part of Donald Trump. And I think he feels frustrated that he wasn't able to do more in the first term, and he's coming back at it. And you look at the region where we are, Brazil suddenly beginning to think about the European Union in a different light. You look at what's happening up in Mexico, the idea of 1,000% tariffs landing on particular factories. These are things that could change the world fairly dramatically.
Do you think we're exaggerating the difference between him and quite a lot of previous, certainly Republican presidents? I mean, even in the 80s, there has often been a very transactional approach to trade, and one-sided deals have been done. Pressure was put on Japan at key moments, everything else. I mean, if you were just looking at this through an America First lens, could an America First lens actually achieve quite a lot for the American economy?
You can argue that it did a bit in the first term, is that it didn't cause as much damage as some people thought, but it was just a lot smaller. I think it was on $360 billion worth of goods. Now he's aiming at the whole $3 trillion of imports, which is a much bigger zone. I think compared with previous efforts in this regard, yes, America has always had something of an industrial policy. You can remember the stuff about Japan in the 1980s. You can see what they've done on chips more recently, and you can just take the basic attitude that there isn't that much difference between what has happened so far, because Biden has hung on to most of Trump's tariffs. I think the difference is now that he is massively expanding that front. I mean, that there is a big difference between hitting $360 billion worth of goods and hitting $3 trillion. I mean, that is a much larger, and the sort of numbers he's implying he's going to do are much bigger. And the interesting question will be whether other countries kind of cave, or whether they unite possibly against it.
Yeah, John's just said that that tariffs are much deeper in the Trump psyche than we perhaps had imagined. It's really a core foundational belief for Trump. And I think you could also say that tariffs are much deeper in the American psyche than we'd often imagined. If you go back to Hamilton and the infant industries argument, he based his entire tax system on tariffs. The federal government couldn't tax, so it paid for itself by tariffs. You had very high tariffs protecting American industries all the way through the 19th century. So America's been a pro-tariff country, particularly, in Chicago and places like that, and particularly with the Republican Party. But nevertheless, when you had Smoot-Hawley coming in 1930, which was an imposition of new tariffs, a large number of big new tariffs on top of already existing tariffs, that plunged the world economy and the United States into a deeper depression. So even if you have a background of tariffs, if you exaggerate and increase that predilection, you can, do enormous damage. And he does have a Smoot-Hawley sort of mindset.
I mean, it's quite interesting that he is this time, he would be taking on many of the bedrocks of kind of other people's economies. So German cars, that is a very big deal. He boasted about how he persuaded Macron to kind of give in over things by mentioning champagne and wine. But there's some point where luxury goods, if he goes for that, again, it's going to be difficult. And I think it does, it is the danger of, you mentioned Smoot-Hawley, the danger of tariffs is that it begins to create a narrative, is that there is a limit to how much another country can quietly give in. I do think in America there are deep antecedents on this, as Adrian pointed out. The favourite word, which I saw Howard Lutnick use on television, was, McKinley is the go-to president for a lot of the Republican Party at the moment, because it provides a reason to say it won't be that bad. This is how it's a great, strong American tradition. And there is definitely an advantage in being America because the economy is so big. And so I think, Stephanie could correct me, I think it's like 27% of the American economy is reliant on trade. I think other places it's much, much higher because they're small. You're Britain, I think you're twice that, or certainly 1.5 times that. And the reason why is, in Britain is a smaller place where you're almost bound to be importing and exporting things.
But just to play devil's advocate a bit, I mean, his view is that America, being still the biggest kid on the block, in these negotiations, we didn't, in your interview, didn't explicitly talk about retaliation, but of course, a lot of the cost that we see for the US economy from having tariffs is the response that other countries would make. That it would be harder for US companies to export. So you might be helping some import competing industries, but you would be damaging those exporters. I think his implicit line is, well, let them try, because we're big enough. We can threaten them with something else. We can cut them off SWIFT or whatever it might be. He thinks everything's on the table. Short run, that's probably true, right?
I think also it's part of a narrative whereby he thinks that America has been hoodwinked, has given everything away. Lutnick on the television was complaining about the Marshall Plan. America's trying to do everything for everybody else, and again that slightly goes against history in the sense of you look at all these things like what happened with Japan, what happened with chips. Secondly, quite interestingly, and Fareed Zakaria has made this point quite entertainingly, if these people who think that America has sold itself down the river, by virtually every measure, the American economy has grown at the expense of the European one. So if the Europeans are doing something devious, they're not doing it very well. And the worry is that this actually could come back. There is a point at which every politician cannot keep giving in.
My reflection on to take two of your points, the one you just mentioned there around Trump thinking that, America's kind of been, bailing everyone out or whatever, is around defense spending. And we talked about it before, talk about it again, but we've got a budget coming next week where, they may or may not get up to 2.5% on defense spending. But the question I have, and lots of people have, is it going to be enough for a possible second President Trump? And then the second point is the effect for Britain, an open economy, of being in the middle of what could end up being a trade war. We're having this debate about a set of fiscal numbers and budget that feels slightly like it's not even processed the content of your interview last week, John.
You could argue that no country in the world is kind of more exposed in some ways to Trumpism than Britain in this way, because it is possible, albeit it would be very difficult, it's possible for the European Union to kind of unite around the idea that they also have a market. Maybe they can do deals with countries like Brazil and Mercosur, Africa. They can have a big enough, free enough market to get quite a lot of the benefits of free trade, in the same way as if America cuts itself off from the world, it can do fairly well. The one country, Britain is, possibly alongside places like Singapore, is very badly placed on that, because we were part of this big market where we could have been really that might even have worked somewhat in Britain's favour if we were still part of the European Union. Now it's much, much harder.
Well, the only thing I would say is I think the one thing that could protect the UK, which I agree is otherwise very vulnerable to a global trade war, is the fact that Donald Trump does seem to see in his transactional approach, he judges whether a country has good trade policies by what the trade balance is with the US. And we are one of very few countries that actually has a deficit with the US. So he may let the UK off, whereas he's definitely, you could tell from the interview, he's got Europe in his sights, because there's a big surplus of a lot more goods coming in from Europe than going out to Europe from the US. John Micklethwait, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's talk now to Dani Rodrik. Dani is a widely respected economist, Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, also the author of many books on globalization, trade, and related subjects. Dani Rodrik, thank you so much for joining us. We've just been hearing some of the snippets from our editor-in-chief's conversation with Donald Trump last week, which was surprisingly to some dominated by talk of tariffs. And it certainly, I think, brought home, that interview, how much the America First approach frames his way of looking at a lot of policy and certainly international policy. And we hear a lot about how terrible that is and all the risks and downsides from a sort of traditional economic standpoint. But I'm interested, given your record of being quite open-minded and often critical of the mainstream approach to globalization and global integration, I just wondered where you thought that his approach might be getting it right, and whether protectionism more generally, maybe has its place in a more balanced view of global integration.
Yeah, I don't think he's getting it right. It's not because I think tariffs are going to be tremendously costly. I think it's more because I think a strategy that focuses on tariffs is just going to miss the bigger picture, and it's just going to be, frankly, a distraction from the agenda that does need to be pursued to revive the middle class and create good jobs and strengthen the U.S. economy. I don't think there's anything wrong per se with an America First policy. I don't think there's anything wrong per se with economic nationalism. In fact, I think all elected governments are elected to advance the interests of their nation, the interests of their own national economies. When they do it right, actually, they do a service not only to their own electorate, they do a service for the world economy as a whole. I think, especially for an economy that's systemically as important as the United States, there's no greater gift that a U.S. president can provide to the rest of the world than by generating a strong, thriving, innovative U.S. economy. But I think the problem with tariffs is that it is just not the way to go about do that. And I can get into the details if you want, but I think the main point is that tariffs are a distraction.
Well, I just to follow up on that, because I saw you'd also written a piece about sort of being a bit more, when you talk about countries moving in a more nationalistic direction economically, and specifically policies which are, we've sort of got used to thinking that a level playing field, we must be looking for a level playing field at all times. And then when countries introduce policies that seem to try and skew the playing field or are very supporting their producers over others, we've tended to always just condemn that as against free trade and against integration. But you suggested we should be more nuanced in the way we look at those kind of more nationalistic policies.
Yeah, I think all successful economic strategies are a mix of letting markets and private firms do their thing, and then governments giving them a little nudge here and there. Sometimes it takes the form of subsidizing them. Occasionally, in the past, it's taken the form of trade restrictions. So I think we need to be open-minded. I think the problem with just focusing on tariffs first and foremost is that it just doesn't give the necessary nudge. You basically are just telling producers, I'm going to allow you to raise prices. And generally speaking, if you allow them to raise prices, they might produce a little bit more. So you might get a domestic supply response for those industries that will receive the trade protection. But there's nothing in tariffs per se that will get them to innovate, to create good jobs, to bring online the industries of the future and technologies of the future. Tariffs are okay as a temporary shield when you have a genuine industrial strategy or a genuine economic strategy that is targeting all the challenges of our day, whether it's good jobs or climate change or addressing the needs of lagging regions. But on their own, they're just they're an instrument they lack essentially any power to achieve those ends.
Danny, could I ask you a little bit about history? Because I think the British in particular, but also the economic profession in general, tend to think of America historically as being like a big version of Britain. And they think of it as being a free trading nation. But actually, surely tariffs have been central to American history. The free trading regime's relatively recent. And so if you saw the reaction to Trump's talking about tariffs, that hits something quite deep in the American psyche, doesn't it?
I think that's right. I think it is good to bring in history. It is true that America basically caught up and surpassed Britain in the second half of the 19th century behind very high levels of tariffs. But if you looked at that experience and you thought it was just the tariffs that did it, you'd really miss everything else that was taking place, whether it's the the land grant colleges, whether it's the investment in public infrastructure, whether it was all the other encouragements to domestic industries that was taking place. I don't like to be doctrinaire about tariffs, and I do think that much of the discussion today about the cost of Trump's tariffs really paint a picture that sort of is the worst possible outcome. I mean, I can give you a scenario where Trump's tariffs, let's say 10% across the board tariffs on all imports, could generate a catastrophe. But I sort of think it's unlikely that that's what will happen. I think, again, what I worry about is that becomes the U.S. strategy.
But just to repeat a historical point, you could easily argue that the Republican Party is essentially historically a protectionist party. It was a protectionist party in the late 19th century. It was a protectionist party in the 1920s. There was an aberration with Reagan, but basically Trump is taking that party back to its roots, which is why the guys in Chicago were cheering him.
That is true. So the Republicans were, of course, the party of high tariffs because they were the party of business, and business were trying to compete with Britain, which was, of course, the major economic power of the day. But there's another tradition in U.S. economic history, which is actually a free trade tradition that comes from a somewhat different side. Historically, one of the most significant populist traditions was the one that rose to the fore in the United States in the 1890s with the U.S. People's Party.
Norman Thomas, the great socialist presidential candidate, I think 6 times presidential candidate, was a free trader. And Cordell Hull, of course, is a free trader. It's much more on the left, the free trading tradition, and the right's much more protectionist, I think.
Yeah. So there has been in the progressive tradition certainly a kind of a free trade, strong free trade stream. And part of it is, as the U.S. progressive believes, that high tariffs were essentially a giveaway to business. And that's why U.S. progressives, for example, didn't like tariffs, because they thought it was a pro-business. It was a pro-elite policy.
So what I'm trying to get at is that Trump is not necessarily this great aberration for the Republican Party. He's actually going back to quite a deep Republican business tradition of protectionism.
Well, yes and no. But I think the U.S. position in the world economy has changed so much that I think it's difficult to draw I think the reason that the U.S. conservative establishment, the business establishment, became free trader after the Second World War was just the sense that the U.S. economy was on top of the world, that their interests were going to be best served by free trade. So maybe going back to that tradition is also partly that the U.S. has lost ground, that is falling behind.
Danny, you've made a name over the years for pointing out the sort of inconvenient truths about international economics and highlighting when there were several objectives that we'd like to think we can achieve all at the same time. And you would say, no, you can only achieve 2 out of 3. You talked about trilemmas. There was a very famous one more years ago about globalization, which I don't want to get into. But more recently, you've highlighted that if we have countries like the US, but also European Union, it's now imposing tariffs on China, other countries concerned about restoring the middle class in advanced economies. Countries can't do that and combat climate change and still provide a sort of path to development for places like China, but also other developing countries. You can't do all 3 of those, you've suggested. You could only do 2 out of the 3. I just wondered if you could go into that a bit more and I guess sort of highlight, if whatever we think about Donald Trump's policies, he's not alone in wanting to support and sort of re-level the playing field in favor of advanced economies and to some extent protect the middle class from competition from developing countries. That's pretty damaging for the countries that have yet to develop.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 paths here. I mean, one, and the one that I worried about when I wrote about this new trilemma, is that if we go down a path where we basically say the only way that we can lift up the middle class and address climate issues in the United States and Europe is through trade restrictions and through industrial policies that significantly discriminate against the rest of the world, then we're at the heart of that trilemma, because we're going to really make it very difficult for the rest of the world, especially low-income countries, to access markets in the rich countries. And so that's essentially the core of the trilemma. The other path is to realize that, in fact, if you wanted to address climate change and restore the middle class, trade restrictions and discriminatory industrial policies is not really the way you would go about it. And so that's why I want to stress that this is a trilemma that can be overcome if we manage to overcome two fetishes that we're having currently. One is a manufacturing fetish. The other is a kind of an overblown fear of China in the West. I think the manufacturing fetish shows up that in the idea that to create good jobs and shore up the middle class, you need protectionism. But of course, there are very few jobs in manufacturing today. Around 8% of total labor force in the United States are in manufacturing. And there's no way, no amount of protectionism is going to make a huge amount of difference to that. So if you want to address the middle class, both in the United States and Europe, you have to pursue policies that are very different from trade policies or industrial policies that focus on manufacturing or high tech. And I think on climate change, there's no way you're going to address your climate change objectives without managing to allow developing countries to access the kinds of technologies and renewables and new kinds of investments that the US and Europe are trying to incentivize through their own industrial policies. So you'll have to facilitate that as well. So there is a trilemma on the path that we're on, but it's in many ways, it's kind of a false trilemma. It's driven by a kind of a false consciousness of manufacturing fetishism and excessive concern about China, which sort of is in fact, a large part of this economic nationalism.
I can't imagine, given the sort of tone of the conversation, what would have happened if our editor-in-chief had accused Donald Trump of having a manufacturing fetish. I think the conversation could have gone in a whole different direction. Allegra, I know you're particularly interested in the climate agenda. I wonder what you thought of...
Well, the thing that we discussed in the UK was something called the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So I think you can do 2 of your 3, which is essentially if you make the import of goods that have relied on, that appear to be cheap, but that's because you've not priced carbon. If you make them more expensive, then you can then make more competitive goods that could be made within the United Kingdom. And so you create jobs and so on. So you can see that 2 of your 3 have been hit in that way. You have reduced the amount of carbon that's being imported, and you have also beefed up the number of jobs that you're making within, in our case, the United Kingdom, but it's relevant for lots of different countries. What you're then needing to do to be able to try and get anywhere close to the third lever or the third leg of the trilemma or lemma of the trilemma or whatever we call it, is you're then having to think about how you use either the aid budget or other levers to support the international community, as you say, with their transition to lower carbon technology. Some of the wealthier developing nations will do it without needing the support of richer nations because they're getting very rich themselves, but some of them will not be able to. When you have what we have seen occasionally in the United Kingdom, which is this kind of worry about the aid budget being too generous and so on, that becomes difficult.
But I think that's a great example of both the trilemma under our current path and the missed opportunity in terms of the alternative path I presented. The missed opportunity here is that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is actually raising revenue for the EU. And the point of the adjustment mechanism was not to generate revenue, it was to actually protect domestic industries. So why not use that revenue to rebate them directly to the countries, exporting countries that will be harmed by these higher border tariffs, and essentially providing an immediate link between these revenues and incentivizing them through this transfer, the rebates of these revenues to developing countries, to incentivize them to engage in investments in renewable.
I suppose, Professor Roderick, because one of the things that, particularly when we think about it with the United Kingdom hat on, and this is true of some European countries, is that those countries' electorates don't feel very rich. We're about to have a budget in the UK next week, which will be fraught. And it is not obvious how they can raise money in a way that is not painful to some part of the electorate. So even though, compared to developing nations and so on, the United Kingdom's population is comfortable, it's a fraught public debate.
Clearly, the UK has a bigger problem here because of, I think, an artificial sense of the fiscal constraint. But certainly the EU is something could have done that, because the revenues were not a big part of the consideration in phasing in the border adjustment mechanism.
Danny Roderick, that was fantastic. I think we could have carried on a lot longer and gone back into more of your analysis over the years of all these things, which has often predicted some of these debates, although I guess you probably didn't exactly predict Donald Trump, but certainly you predicted some of the tensions that produced him. But thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Voternomics from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders, in Sao Paulo, with help from Adrian Wooldridge and Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi, with production support from Isabella Ward and sound design by Moses Andam. Special thanks to John Micklethwait and Professor Danny Roderick. Please subscribe, rate and review highly this podcast wherever you listen to it.